Secretary Pompeo, I think, of course, what is happening in the world, and doesn't matter if it's in China, Middle East, Latin America, or Europe, it's very much influenced by U.S. In the previous decades, it also happened. But at this time, more than ever, U.S. being a relevant global actor. And talking about U.S., we need to talk about the new administration, where President Trump came out of, not part of the classic politics on the first mandate, then had a lot of setbacks and came on the second mandate and is driving, let's say, the action around the world in his own style, which is different from the classic, the traditional U.S. politics. Doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. What is the phenomenon on the U.S. society that allowed an outsider to come and become president, even with a lot of questioning, a lot of issues, a lot of pitfalls? What happened in U.S. society that allowed President Trump to be such a strong player?
Boy, first of all, thank you, Minister, for having me here. Andre, great to be with you again. If I knew the answer to that, who knows? Who knows what might have happened differently? But there are a couple of things I think that are important, that are global trend lines that certainly exist in the United States. And some of them are idiosyncratic. So think about this. We've never had, in modern times, a president win, lose, and win. By the way, if President Trump were to tell you, he would say he won all three times. Right? We shouldn't forget that. He thinks he won one and one, and so be it. But you remember, it's important. So President Trump has an innate sense of being able to reach people where they are, a certain common sense about him. He's got all his Twitter account, his X account, he's got all that flamboyance, but his messaging is really good in terms of how to reach people. And he created a coalition that voted for him in the states that mattered. We have half a dozen states that are highly competitive in presidential elections that matter, Michigan, Pennsylvania really being the lead too. And he connected with middle-class workers there in a way that President Biden couldn't do. The candidate, Vice President Harris, just had no capacity to do. They looked at her and said, that's just that she's talking about things that don't matter to me, and President Trump is talking about things that matter to me, and that got him across the line, and he won the popular vote all across the country, and his first presidency was viewed as largely successful. You'll recall the last year of it was COVID, so very difficult for all of us serving in the cabinet during that time, and caused the economy to really falter as well. But his presidency was viewed as pretty successful. And then the last thing to remember from the election is what else was unique about it was that you had a former president of the United States running against an incumbent president who then drops out, vice president steps in, and that party, the Democrat Party, had prosecuted and tried to throw President Trump in jail. Right? That's just true. On relatively specious charges. We can all talk about different pieces, but most of it was just, it was not substantive. These weren't the most serious things. And the American people sensed that. And so there was a piece of the electorate that said, I don't want to be part of a model that has the incumbent power trying to throw the opponent into legal jeopardy when it's not material, when the legal jeopardy itself is not material. So I think those things all came together to give President what was a reasonably resounding win, and in President Trump's mind, an enormous mandate to go, frankly, just continue most of the very things he had campaigned on in all three elections. It was a very similar message that he shared pretty consistently over 7-8 years.
Yeah. And Mike, since he took over, and we were discussing by the end of last year, American exceptionalism, right? U.S. markets were outperforming global markets. U.S. was the center of global innovation, amazing wealth creation. The dollar was at all-time high against the key other currencies, and a lot of optimism starting this year. But then things started and we saw a little bit of a messy beginning, and especially these
you could be a diplomat. It's amazing.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
I'm talking to the
you should come work
Secretary
at the
of
State Department or the Foreign Ministry. Exactly.
Definitely, I'm not talking as a banker. Yes. And we saw a little bit messy global world, especially on this obsession about trade and trade deficits.
Yeah.
And this idea in the White House, led by Trump and his closest advisors, not certainly the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, doesn't think like this, but this view of mercantilism view, maybe 19th century, or being here in Portugal, maybe 16th century view of each deficit you are exporting wealth creation to someone else or to somewhere else. But when you look at the facts, U.S. has structural deficits since trade deficits. I'm not talking about fiscal deficits, right? Which is an issue on Brazil.
Separate.
But also in U.S. We'll talk soon about that. Trade deficit since the early 70s. And no one got wealthier or more successful than U.S.
Yes.
So how this idea talks to the reality? And why this obsession with trade deficits where U.S. is in full employment? There is nothing wrong in terms of the society, but why keeping this obsession? And especially, if you could, on a very candid way, about the messy execution of the policy. Because one case is the wrong idea, but the execution was worse than the idea.
Yes, by the way, I'll explain it. I don't agree with President Trump. I think your point is very well taken. I think the United States has enormously benefited from the global economic order that existed for the last, frankly, you could say post-World War II, but certainly the last 20, 25 years. There were pieces of it that were unfair. Frankly, I would have focused more on the risk from China and its predatory economic activity, the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping and his activity. But President Trump just has a different view, and he campaigned on this idea that you could bring good paying jobs back to America, and you could do so by putting a tariff barrier around the U.S. economy. And so, the initial rollout, Liberation Day, by the way, my Liberation Day was January of 2021 when I got what I am today, a private citizen. This idea, the rollout was, we're going to go put these tariffs on everybody and then they can come seek, relief from them. An enormously globally economic disruptive activity that certainly impacts other nations, but impacts the U.S. economy greatly as well. And you saw he's had to step back from some of it. He's now in the process of trying to negotiate a series of, 100+ bilateral trade agreements. These are we were talking about, a bilateral trade agreement runs into the hundreds of pages with appendices and tables and data. This is a massive undertaking. But ideologically, President Trump has this deep belief that if you bring these jobs back to America, we'll be safer, more secure, and more prosperous. I'm from the comparative advantage school of economics, which says there's some things we do really well in the United States, and there's some things that other nations will do better than ours. And they'll change over time as technology advances. And that the thing that really drove American economic exceptionalism, to use your term, or American economic growth, was the fact that we have a pretty flexible economy, massive innovation, and human capital that is unrivaled, and deep capital markets. That combination of things, right, has just made our economy hard to break. Like multiple presidents have tried, and from both parties, to be honest. And the American economy rolls on because most of the activity, most of the thing that creates the power for America sits in the private sector. It's our innovative capacity, the fact that we reward people for good ideas as best we can and for hard work. And I think tariffs drive us back in the wrong direction. Global tariffs drive us back in the wrong direction. There's a handful of things, and particularly I've mentioned China, that I do think we have to protect. We, not just the United States, the West. That would include Latin America, that would include most of Asia, include the Middle East, Gulf Arab states, we do need to protect India. That we need to protect those things. But beyond that, that's more of a security matter than an economic matter. And so I think tariffs actually drive down global economic activity. I think that's net not good for us. President Trump just has a very different view, and you saw that, and you saw it in the rollout, which now has been, tough. I could be a diplomat too, maybe.
But the rollout of the policy and with the merit of giving back on some of the ideas or numbers or parameters, and I totally agree with you, right? You cannot do a term sheet on a trade agreement, right? It's Minister Juma, who is a very experienced judge, can talk about that. It's impossible to have a perfect deal without a couple hundred pages on such a complex topic. But beyond the deal itself has the execution of the deal, right? The bullying with Canada to the point that changed the political landscape for Canadian elections, or the way that U.S. dealt with Europe, with, in my view, some positive consequence to Europe, honestly. At the end, Latin America was not too much affected. And in a certain way, China was, I think President Trump has been quite responsible in dealing with China, but created such noise that in a certain way changed the value of U.S. brand. And the best way to look at that is the dollar.
The dollar, sure.
Right? It's generally, we try, Minister Juma, to associate the value of a currency something related to the economy. There is nothing wrong with U.S. economy. The opposite continues to outperform. But the value of a currency goes beyond the economy. It's about previsibility, about stability, about moral standards, about a strength of institutions, rule of law. And this, let's call, messy environment, I think, trigger a correction on the dollar, right, against the G3, the G7, or even core emerging markets like Brazil. There is nothing happening in Brazil, for good or for bad, and the currency appreciated was the best first 6 months of the year in 30 years. The same in Australia, the same in Chile, the same in Europe, and the same in Japan. How far do you think it can go, and do you think that President Trump is bothered about that, or a weak dollar is not so bad, it's okay, will help us to not trade deficit, and let's live with that?
So President Trump has said repeatedly he's happy with a weaker dollar as a relative currency measure. That doesn't bother him. He is not, unlike just about every president before him who was about making sure we had a strong dollar. Look, the president is determined to keep the dollar as the reserve currency. He gets the importance of that to the American economy, so I don't mean that. He just thinks if it's a little lower, that's great. To your point, it makes us have lower trade deficits relative to a different currency level. We'll see if it actually delivers lower trade deficits in goods. Only time will tell. Two other thoughts about this, though. One is you talked about, I think you may have used the term bully, or sort of how he went about this with Canada and Europe. Having worked with President Trump for 4 years, I saw this several times, where he would make a very broad, deep statement that would often irritate others. It had a nugget of truth buried inside of it every time, right? The fact that Europe has been underinvesting in its own security for 25, 27 years is fundamentally true.
Yes, totally.
And other presidents have tried to get them to do more, and they've been nice about it, or they've been more diplomatic about it. And President Trump, he's like, no, Mike, that's not going to get it done. We need to go just, be more difficult.
And by the way, work it.
And it has worked.
Yeah.
And so you have to credit, as much as the modality may be annoying, it worked. It worked better than any previous president. And I hope that the Europeans are now taking this on board in a serious way. It's not just momentary, but they will, because these things take years, they will spend the next decade getting to a better place for their own level of security. Other things, we're going to go invade Greenland, or Canada's the 51st state,
or the Gulf of America.
Yeah, the Gulf of America. I kind of like that. That's catchy. But by the way, unlike the other two, not material, right? The other two affects sovereign space. The name of something is not that. Look, I view that, to your point, I view that as, even if it has some effect that he's desiring, it also diminishes from this American model that I'm very proud has put America in a place for 40 years where the world looked to us as institutional gold, right? Property rights. We would defend human rights, even if we didn't always get it perfect. We would talk about it in a serious way. You could invest in America in our deep capital markets, and you could have confidence that the rule of law was there, that you'd get treated fairly, no matter where your company was from. We were on the world stage leading when trouble arose. It was almost always the United States that was looked to say, hey, go put that problem, go take care of that problem. By the way, I was a soldier a long time ago, right? At great cost to the United States of America in terms of not only dollars, but our lives of our young men and women. That's very real. What I worry about, especially in my party, in the Republican Party today, is that we're only counting the costs and not the benefits. The United States has been an enormous beneficiary of all of this leadership. And you can see it in the strong dollar, American GDP growth that is unrivaled, the world looking to us, and we can't lose that. And when I say we now, I actually don't mean the United States. I hope no one will take offense at this. There's nobody that's going to replace that. Yeah. There's no second other than maybe Chinese Communist Party. If you're looking for someone who's going to lead on the global stage to try and drive success, whether that's in the economic affairs with the World Bank or the IMF or the World Trade Organization or at the UN, there's nobody that can fill that gap. And so if we shy away from that, if we come to be viewed as just another nation filled with petty corruption or not holding ourselves to the highest standard, at least rhetorically, even if we don't always live up to it, I get that. We always fall short. I do too. But if we don't at least honor that, then I think it's a much less prosperous world. We will struggle more to feed that next billion people that are going to occupy the planet, mostly south of the equator. And it'll be a world that rewards folks like Xi Jinping and Chairman Kim and Vladimir Putin in ways that aren't in any of our best interest. Yeah. Does that get to the question?
Yeah, yeah. Totally agreed. And to explore a little bit more of that before we go more global, it's this is the risk. And looking at the political landscape in U.S. and you're a privileged observer, Secretary Pompeo was also a congressman before and was part of U.S. Army before, and Harvard Law School. Mm-hmm. So you understand what it means, the Harvard debate with Trump right now, and could be part of this, and certainly the presence of international students in the U.S. prime universities was a source of strength for U.S. Part of innovation was driven by these different people that went there and loved the model, have fantastic education. Minister Gilmar also founded a law school in Brazil. We also at BTG founded a tech school in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And we are both proud of trying to promote high-level education. Mm-hmm. And this is the spirit of the question. Do you think, analyzing the landscape today, the American institutions or checks and balance will be there, and the Supreme Court, if needed, will be there. Yeah. The political landscape or establishment will be there. Yeah. Congress will be there. Yeah. The judge will be there. Yeah. Markets will be there. Yeah. That's, I think, the spirit of the question.
No, I appreciate that. It's probably the most important question. You should know I'm very confident that they will be there. We've had our moments in history before, in the 1970s, early 70s. And you could go back to a handful of others. This system, this foundational system that our Constitution has driven, I'm convinced will carry us through all of these turbulent times. I truly believe that. I know where I'm sitting today. I'd still bet on America, and do. It doesn't mean that there aren't great things going to happen all across the world and that we don't need that to happen. The United States does. But our courts will stand up. They'll be fractious. I wish political leaders wouldn't go after the courts. By the way, both parties have done this. They've attacked rhetorically Supreme Court justices. That's just not useful. You're going to get decisions you don't like. You've probably issued a few.
We are used to that in
people
Brazil.
didn't like. Yes, exactly.
That well,
yeah, but we all are. And by the way, we'll think the guy that was on the court or gal was like on our team, but they're not on our team. They're on the institution team. They're on the team of law, right? They're on the team of, in our country, on our Constitution, right? And so sometimes you're going to get decisions you're going to, it's just no good. But by the way, you can critique the legal logic. That's completely in bounds. But don't drive it to be another political body. And our members of Congress too, that's a tough job. They need to stand up and defend their institution as well. They need to make sure they maintain the power of the legislative branch against the executive branch in a way that does provide a real check. And it's been diminishing. When I was there, it was diminished. It was diminished even more after I've left. The executive now holds enormous amount of power, very different from where it was 50 or 75 years ago. But I will tell you the most important institutions that I believe, they are twofold, and you hit them both. One is our educational institutions. They have always been a primary driver for American security success and economic success. Students from all across the world, if we could educate our young kids a little bit better in our schools, there'd be more Americans studying there. Mm-hmm. I'm very much worried about our public education system. It has driven so much for our nation for so long. It's a bit of a different story. But those institutions will find a path, and not just the elite institutions either, not just Harvard and Cornell and Columbia, but all of them. Kansas State, KU, the University of Nevada, Denver, right? These institutions that educate large numbers of the American population, I'm convinced they'll find their path to continued success and raise the next generation of American leadership. The other important one is, I'll call it American greed. That's the most negative thing I can describe, is because I deeply believe that if you set the right economic incentives and the right rules, really good things happen for every class of the American people, from the wealthiest to the least amongst us. I'm an old school Republican. It's not about rising tides lift all boats. It's about, if you create the incentives for people to operate inside an economic system, they will figure out how to take care of their families, right? That's what drives us all. It's what motivates everyone in this room, right? So you're a patriotic Brazilian or a patriotic American or a patriotic Portuguese, but in the end, you really care about your family, right? You want good things for your family. I became a grandpa 3 months ago. Like, I only had to worry about 40 years. Now I got to worry about 100 years. And we've always been really good about creating the right incentives for capital to go to good ideas and for people to get jobs that took care of them if they were willing to work their tail off. And I do worry that Americans are losing a little bit of that work ethic that has been unique, I think, in the world, because I think we've now created a model which doesn't always reward that. And we got to get that institutional piece of America is what will bring the smartest people to the Silicon Valley, to Wall Street, to our industrial businesses in the Midwest, to say, no, I want to go be part of that. And without that human capital, it's difficult to imagine how we continue to be that important paragon of virtue and institutional rectitude that America really needs to be.
Yeah, no, great. I totally agree with you. Mike, before we move to more global geopolitical topics, still in U.S., but on the macro side, I have one macroeconomic and one micro side related to technology. But on the macro side, we approved yesterday the big, beautiful bill. For those less familiar, it's a very important bill that President Trump sent to Congress, and a lot of discussions, because in a moment of high deficit in U.S., it talks about, among other things, on tax cuts and other things. And certainly, it will be discussed in the House as we speak.
Yeah, it may have passed while we're sitting here.
Okay, yes.
I soon, today. It'll happen today.
Yeah, it will happen today.
Yeah.
And it's a big, beautiful bill. We all know...
It's very big.
We all know that it's very big.
Yeah.
But there are some doubts about how beautiful it is. So what's your take on this big move, especially in a moment of high deficit in the U.S.?
So had I been a member of Congress, I would have voted for this. That's always the easiest way for me to explain it. I voted for a lot of bills that had some really bad stuff in them. And, sadly, you do that from time to time. And this has that too. There were really important pieces that the world will come to appreciate. So the fact that we didn't raise tax rates, right, it would have been an automatic set of tax increases in the next coming months, would have been really bad for the American economy, in my view. So this will make those tax cuts permanent, the tax levels permanent. They're still, in my judgment, too high. As a global matter, we still aren't as competitive on tax policy and marginal taxes as we should be, but better than if we hadn't passed this. Second, it's got some amazing provisions with respect to the American economy. Immediate expensive of all capital investments. This will be great. Your investment bank will figure out how to make a lot of money off this. Which, by the way, I say that happily. I'm thrilled with that.
It's part of the job description.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And by the way, that's the great thing. If you don't, there'll be a successor to you, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. This is the great thing about markets. So and there's other regulatory stuff that doesn't get talked about much that were regulations that made no more sense than Man in the Moon, in my judgment. This will get rid of them. These will all underpin the American economy in the year or 18 months ahead. It is the case that it is likely to continue to drive up our deficit, our annual deficit, and of course, as a result of that, total debt. Today, that number is $36.5 trillion against an economy of smaller than that. Someday, you bankers are going to call us on that. Someday, the Treasury window will open, and we will try to issue some debt, and the world will say, I'm not so sure that interest rate is sufficient. We
in Brazil know this pretty well.
Yes, exactly. No. Yeah. By the way, you're not unique. Many countries do. We've benefited. One, we've been relatively sane on this for years. And second, because we have the reserve currency, and as a relative matter, it's a safe place to store money, people still buy treasuries, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and by the way, but we've been riding on that for a long time. Interest on our debt this year will be over $1 trillion. I think that's bigger than all but 15 or 20 economies. Think about that. That's just interest only. No banker ever takes a deal where the debtor can only pay interest, right? Or at least they say, yeah, you can do that for 1 year, but you got to start to pay back principal before too long. We're now borrowing to pay interest. So you have to grow the economy, and then you have to become less profligate. And this is the political problem, which is you see this fight over our healthcare system. It's Medicaid. It is healthcare ostensibly for those who are unable to work or those who are in a very low income level. It grows faster than inflation every year. It is completely unsustainable. The Big Beautiful Bill tries to encourage people. It says in some, you have to at least try to find a job to qualify if you're able-bodied or you're not a single parent at home. And that was enormously controversial. By the way, even in the Republican Party, there were many Republicans that didn't want to vote for what I would view as common sense. That tells you how hard it is to really get at the actual problem, because Kansans are going to say, no, I want my crop subsidies. I want you to provide federal dollars to provide insurance for my crops. And that's Kansas. We're pretty Republican, but we're not adverse to taking taxpayer money. And this is the political problem. And if you said, Mike, over 8-10 years, what worries you most about the American economy is we don't find a trajectory that even if we can't get back to a balanced budget, which seems like a very large political task, we have to get back to something that allows the economy to grow underneath it. So, debt to EBITDA equivalent in the government space is irrational again. And we're not there, and we are still moving backwards.
Yeah. You made very interesting comments on interest rates. And as you know, the Fed governor is a lawyer, and the ECB governor is a lawyer. and President Trump is in search of a new governor of the Fed. So be alert. You can always get an unexpected invitation, right? And
apparently the Fed governor can't be fired, so maybe that's a good gig. Anyway, yes, we'll have a new Fed governor in the next year, right? His term expires somewhere.
May.
Yeah. May.
But I think President Trump will appoint before fourth quarter of this year.
That's probably right.
Probably right. Yeah. So it's in search moment.
Yeah. I'll keep my head down.
Mike, final question on U.S. Economy, which is in reality more related to technology. U.S. has been leading innovation globally and created amazing companies, right? And part of the economic success of the U.S. was this amazing wealth creation originated from innovation, right? Where else in the world a company in less than 24 months created $2 trillion of market capitalization like NVIDIA? It's amazing. By its merits, right? Its profits every quarter, is innovation, is engineering, is new ideas, is merit, proper, absolutely clear. No subsidies, no craziness, no crony capitalism. It's merit.
Straight up innovation and productivity.
Yes. But on the other hand, it created discussions all over the world that is happening now and will happen in the future, including in Brazil. You have a lot of questions about how to regulate this unregulated space, or even these now $1 trillion or $1 trillion companies. And what sorts of regulation do you think we should have? And I will extend the question on technology, which is also related related to regulation, which is AI, right? We are probably a few years to superintelligence and a little bit few years more to quantum computing, which when we were in the university, you were slightly older than me. I'm a mathematician by background, and it was for me science fiction. This quantum computing was science fiction. It was theoretically we could do that, right? It's like on the 40s, people talking about nuclear fusion.
It's like fusion.
It was theory, right? How you see AI transforming our lives and the obligation and what the political leadership could do to protect us as a society if we need this protection.
Yeah. So I think those of us who aren't in that space probably think we understand it a lot better than we really do. That's my first rule. Certainly political leaders don't understand these technologies at the level of depth that, in my judgment, have any prayer of actually regulating this in an intelligent way. It just moves, the scale of this is just so staggering, and the speed with which it evolves so surprising, right? I pick a number, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, if you would have said there's this company called NVIDIA and it's worth all the, we would have gone, someone escort
this. They do graphics in computer.
But a whiteboard stuff, right? Theoretically it could happen, but it's not possible. There's a company that none of us have heard of today just like that somewhere in the world that started up 6 months ago or a year ago, and we just don't know, and they're going to do something that will astound us all. I think it's probably in the United States, but it may not be. It could sit in China, but it could sit in a lot of places today because so much more can be done now without big teams, without thousands of engineers coding and doing, right? So it's pretty remarkable how you see these 5-person billion-dollar companies. And so I do think that creates this risk that is hard to quantify. And so as I think about how you begin to regulate these things, I think 3 things. One, I think you should do it through what I'll call negative regulations. You should say, here are things you can't do, because those we can get our arms around. So people can differ, but we should say in the world of genetics, hey, you can't go build a human being. I'm being a little oversimplified, but we should say, bad idea, and we're going to stop you short of that. And then you can have all this other space to go do all this good stuff and create the next pill that allows me to live to 150 years old. But the genetics field is fascinating to see how AI is improving the quality of lives, but is doing some things that are also frightening. But those are the kind of things you could do. You could put regulations on social media that say, we don't know exactly which pieces are good, and it's hard to tell deep fake from a real one, and we're going to try to all figure that out. But here's what we can say for sure. 12-year-olds, no. Right? We're going to protect our kids from some of these things, right? So you can begin to put some barriers around the edges that at least try to mitigate the worst risks. Beyond that, I think it's really hard to say, Europe says we're going to go put these digital boundaries on, and I just keep saying, good luck. You'll draft the rule and tomorrow it'll be obsolete. And by the way, the rule will be wrong. And if you regulate too much in Europe, we'll crush you in America because we won't. And so I think the best ideas will come from the academic world that are really staring at this in a deep way and trying to think through what it means. There are important workforce issues about what AI can do. America has near perfectly total employment. As a practical matter, those people who are employable are working, and who want to work are working today. If productivity gains are as much as we think, that presents risk. Probably not to the total workforce, but certainly it will be disruptive in ways that the Industrial Revolution was disruptive. I don't think anybody's really thought about, all right, and now how do we manage that over the next 20 years? And so I do think there's government function can help us think through this transmission of knowledge to this handful of folks and make sure that we still have opportunities. And I would say this, as someone who's got a law degree, lawyers may go first with AI, right? I remember toiling in those rooms, opening the books, trying to write a brief and trying to find the citation and figure out if it had been overruled. Those days are gone. Still time as a human being to provide the judgment, but the brute force methodology that I employed as a young lawyer is no longer needed. And I made a good living.
Code is the same.
Yeah, and coding would be the same. So many, call them white-collar jobs, are the same. They were intellectual, but they were fairly rote. Yeah. And if it's intellectual and rote, probably vanishes over some period of time. But we should look at these technologies, at this enormous opportunity. I can't prove this. I can just go from history. Every time we've been worried about a new technology undermining the world, it's turned out to make it a lot better. I've seen theoretical, but I see no reason to believe that this won't be the same. That my grandson will live in a world that is a better, more productive world than the one I lived in. I think that's right, but it'll take some boundaries and some political leadership to make it so.
Yeah, I totally agree. You mentioned China related to innovation, and now we explore a little bit more of global geopolitics. But talking on starting with an internal reflection about China, it's China is doing an amazing job in technology and an amazing job in switching their economic model from deep investments in infrastructure, real estate, to more innovation-driven, tech-driven. But all of us here that lives in liberal democracies, it's difficult for us to believe in innovation driven by the state.
Yeah.
But so far, China has been performing. And how sustainable, in your view, is this model of China that has been successful to take China out of poverty in basically 30 years, but now is under check, right? There is a huge real estate challenge, a huge business model change, and with the same leadership.
Yeah.
How worried you are on, or reflexive you are on the sustainability of this economic model?
Yeah. I would not want to play their hand. I think they have got staggering problems economically, demographically, institutionally, and structurally. over the long term. So when 50 years, I think it is, right? They're going to go from 1.4 billion people today or so to 1 billion people. That is, you can just write this down.
Mike,
Yeah.
if you ask ChatGPT,
Yeah.
what is the population of China in 2100, it will answer 567 million.
That's right.
Which is the most remarkable
Yeah.
population shrink
Yeah.
of modern times.
And no civilization has ever survived a fraction of that shrinkage. I tried to be generous with 1 billion, that they just, you can't have enough babies over the right time. It just, the math doesn't work, right? I suppose you could have massive migration, but unlikely to happen too. So, very difficult hand to play. In the medium term, think 3 years to 10, 12 years, the fact of the problem of 50 years worries me. The Chinese leadership knows that as a relative matter of power, that is, relative to the United States, China and its leadership today believe they are at their most powerful moment. They have more economic power, they have more military capability, they have a better space program, good cyber, good technology. Relative to the rest of the world, they think this is their maximalist point. And historically, when nations believe they are at their high point, what do? They go try and take real estate. They do it either militarily, or they do it diplomatically, or they do it economically. And I think that's what you've seen Xi Jinping do. I think he has said this is, it's a rough translation from Mandarin, but the message had been, and the governance principle had been, grow our economy, and they did build some amazing businesses, Tencent, Baidu. I mean, I could go on. These are really, DeepSeek is really good. These are remarkable businesses, but their model had been very different than Xi's model. Xi has now put their military and security priority way ahead of their economic. He has been willing to suffer economically to gain his capacity to be a global power. And the question is, can we all push back against that in the next 10 years in a way that we don't all live in a world that looks more like theirs, that we still live in liberal democracies, not governing models that look more like theirs. And so there is this window that Xi believes it is go time. The Mandarin phrase was, hide your power and bide your time. And they have now taken that out of the Chinese Communist Party doctrine and essentially said it's go time. And you see that in every dimension of their efforts around the world, their diplomatic efforts, either big technology companies like Huawei trying deeply to embed dangerous intelligence tools. So every dimension of Chinese power is now being fully exploited. And the question is, does the West rise and the inflection point in China begins to struggle? Which, by the way, I'm not rooting for struggle there. A civilizational collapse in China is bad for all of us. This problem of their shrinkage won't be limited to them, right? They're a huge market. There's lots of reasons for this. But we do need to make sure that while they are feeling like this is their maximum point of power, that we continue to defend the central institutions that have built, the post-Bretton Woods, that have built this global economic model that has served the world pretty damn well.
Yeah, served it very well.
Yeah. Look, there are places that we still have immense poverty, and we've got to figure that out. And we still have to figure out how to distribute food. I think we've got enough food. You Brazilians will make all the soybeans we can handle in the world. I'm confident of that.
Yeah.
But we do have to figure out how to get it to the places where there aren't enough calories, there's not enough protein. And I don't think the Chinese model has a prayer of delivering that, and that's what really worries me. Our model does, the Western model does. Theirs will look really bad for the whole world.
Do you think this challenge is well designed inside the new administration, or there is a clear strategy in the West to deal with China? Because we talk all the time, well, it's military actions in Taiwan, but I honestly, I don't see this happening in the near future, because the pro-China parties in Taiwan, they have 35–40%. Sooner or later, they will be 50 plus one in the election.
No,
it's much easier for China win the election than promote an invasion.
That's great geostrategic analysis. I completely agree. They'll do it like they did Hong Kong.
Yes,
right? Yes, exactly.
Just wait. The China is traditionally a patient. So if I was running China, clearly that would be my choice. The most optimized choice is let's play politics and we'll get there without any shoot. Having said that, I do see, even though that I think President Trump treated China respectful in this confusion about trade war, and he has some quite important questions, right? It's valid questions like, well, TikTok operates freely in US. Why WhatsApp doesn't work in China? It's a good question. It's a valid question and proper question. Do you think there is a strategy or a consensus in US, not necessarily about President Trump, a consensus about how to deal with this legitimate questioning?
So there is a consensus that it must be dealt with. The strategy is not well developed yet, either inside the administration or even more broadly, because it's so complicated, right? It's so difficult. Their economy is so intertwined with ours. For 40 years, we told every American business, go invest in China. They did. Right? I mean, no, that was U.S. policy, right? And by the way, those companies benefited from it. I think China benefited from it as well, but certainly these American companies did. And now we're saying, hey, hang on. And that disruption is economically and politically difficult. And so the strategy is not well developed. It's beginning to take form, which is we will build out a greater security model that deters the Chinese Communist Party from things like invading Taiwan or, worse yet, Japan, right? I mean, if you stare at the Pacific, they've claimed the right to the South China Sea. I mean, this is ludicrous as an international legal matter. You might know more about this than me, but I've had to spend too much time defending this as a diplomat, not as a lawyer. But I mean, they're making these ludicrous claims, and they're not doing that because they're playing patty cake. They're doing this because they are determined to go expand their region of influence and power for security and economic reasons. And we have to develop a strategy, and we're getting closer to that. The last thing I do want to say about this that I think is important is that when I started this discussion in many ways, U.S. policy had always been very accommodative towards the Chinese. Since Dr. Kissinger traveled there in 1972 and opened up relations with China. I would debate him about this because and by the way, it's always scary debating Dr. Kissinger, so much smarter than me. I'm surely I'll lose this debate, but I'm right, so maybe.
I heard an interesting comment about that. It's I met Dr. Kissinger in the CFR board, where I'm part for more than 10 years. And someone told me, well, listen, the U.S. has so many fronts these days. You have Europe, Ukraine, Russia, you have China, you have all the complex of Middle East that we'll talk in a second, that even if you have 5 Dr. Kissinger, it would not handle all of that properly.
That may be,
and the problem is that we have half Dr. Kissinger.
Yes,
so it's,
exactly. No. Unequaled, for sure. Look, my thought here is this. We all, Western democracies, liberal democracies, have a shared interest in confronting this challenge. And I hope I've been as careful as I need to be. This isn't a China challenge. This is the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping that presents the challenge. There are really amazing people around him, many of whom were trained in the U.S., who, if they were leading China today, I'd be much more confident that the world had a path forward without the risk that the Chinese Communist Party presents. But I would often hear, I'd travel to Europe or to Latin America, and they'd say, hey, Mike, that's your fight. We're not going to pick sides as between China and the United States. You're the big elephants. We don't want to get run over. And I would say, and I mean this with all due respect and from my heart, you got to pick a side. And it's not as between China and the United States. It's as between liberal democracy and freedom or tyranny. That's the option set. It's much like the option set as between the Soviet Union and the United States. You weren't picking the United States. You were picking a model, a framework, a system. And I think every liberal democracy knows that they've got the right end of the stick on that. And so that necessarily means you are picking the side of freedom and of private property and of human dignity, right? These central concepts that have animated the world for decades now are at risk of being lost if the Chinese Communist Party prevails. Xi Jinping doesn't give a rip. Vladimir Putin's lost somewhere near 1 million of his own people, and he doesn't lose an ounce of sleep. Not one. I was a Secretary of State and CIA director. I prayed every day that my officers in the field were safe. And I was very lucky. I didn't lose a single officer under my control for 4 years. We had some injured, but I didn't have a single one. But had I lost one life, we had soldiers killed during my time. I went to Dover. I cared about these people. Xi Jinping this doesn't compute for us. Like, it's hard for us to imagine, but he doesn't care. The fact that he had a virus escape from a lab in Wuhan, and it killed 10 million people, doesn't bother him. It's not that it was a weapon. He didn't aim. It wasn't his. He didn't intend. He didn't say, "Yeah, let's put this virus in." But the fact that it did causes him, and the fact that in the moment when he could have maybe done something about it, instead of going to the world and saying, "We need your help to figure out how to take care of this," instead he hid it and he shot the people who let it out, and he took the journalists who were learning about it and he put them in prison. Like, this is wanton, reckless disregard for human life. And we can't let that become the model that the world lives in. And so this is the reason that I ask all of us, individually and as nations, to firmly pick that side of human dignity and property rights and freedom. Because if we don't, it will come back to haunt us all.
Yeah. No, it's a pretty valid point. You mentioned Russia, and now to conclude our conversation, let's talk about the problems. We were just talk about the challenge.
The hot wars. Yes.
How do you see and a huge change in Europe, and again, in a certain way, President Trump with his own style, but created, I think, an important wake-up call for Europe. Not necessarily negative.
Yeah.
I think the swing of Germany, I think, was quite positive for Germany and for Europe.
Yeah.
Look at what's happening here, and in all dimensions, people from Spain, Portugal, France, Germany. I was in the President Macron event 3 weeks ago, and it was about capital attraction, simplifying rules, fast approvals. So maybe I'm the wrong people. People are speaking French, but I apparently arrived in America. There is something wrong in this conversation here.
Something changed.
Yes, something changed, and amazing, a new direction in Germany that I think it's quite possible quite positive for Europe. But having said that, we still need to digest this crazy situation of Russia and Ukraine. And how do you see the evolution of this conflict? How to stop this thing going on, not in the center of Europe, but in Europe?
Yeah. Goodness. By the way, I think President Trump should get some credit for this. The remainder of the credit goes to Putin. Right? Between the two of them, I think they got Europe thinking, we got to get after this again. And not just in security, your point's exactly right, economically too.
Because it was the trigger for a lot of change in the mindset, especially, that, now we need to take care of ourselves.
No, I think that's right. So as for the conflict, I see no evidence that Vladimir Putin has any intention of standing down. Frankly, he has very little incentive to stand down at this point, given his value set and the way he thinks about the world. So the West is going to have to continue. Europe primarily, but the United States too, is going to have to impose costs on him. They're going to have to this is like deterrence 101, right? The costs have to be made to exceed the benefits. And today he thinks the benefits exceed them. And so, I read this morning, he made a big advance on the real estate. This for me this isn't about the real estate. I get the real estate problem, but the real challenge is, how do you create a security architecture that stabilizes this and gets you to a ceasefire and gets you to a mode that prevents this from happening again for, I don't know, never forever, 25 years. And the Europeans will have to be at the center of that, and I think they now recognize that. But as long as Vladimir Putin feels like he can, his economy is now a wartime economy, and his economy can survive as long as the war goes on. And second, he thinks I can get a little more stuff, and President Trump's not going to impose costs on me. I suspect that a year from now, it doesn't look terribly different than it looks today. Which is, by the way, I predicted a year ago it would look the same. It does. So I'm 1 for 1. I hope I don't go 2 for 2. I hope I'm wrong about this. But I don't see, these things always have a way of changing abruptly. I don't see a path today that causes this to settle out other than what you're seeing today. Ukrainian attacks into Russia, and Russia just slowly advancing. This morning I read that the North Koreans are putting 30,000 more troops into Russia.
30,000?
30,000 more. Think about this. 30,000 troops is, pick 2 divisions, European or American divisions. This is a lot of people. And I would, just one other thing to keep in your mind, I spent a lot of time with Chairman Kim. I can never get that part of my life back. We were unsuccessful at getting to give up his nuclear weapons. It was a failure of Mike Pompeo for sure. We didn't get it done. But what I came to realize was Chairman Kim does almost nothing without the blessing of the Chinese. It is a subsidiary of China as an economic matter and as a military matter. And so one should not forget that those 30,000 soldiers that are North Korean by ethnicity, that are now going to Russia over, I think they said the next 6 months, are really Chinese. Not as of ethnicity, but this is the Chinese military effort to support Vladimir Putin, is to say, you're not taking my kids, but you can take those North Korean kids. And this happened with more than just the approval of Xi Jinping, but I'm sure I say I'm sure, I guess I don't really know. I'm very confident that this happened at his urging. So when folks say the Chinese have stayed out of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, I'm throwing the BS flag on that.
Let me, since this, which is a frightening comment, right? It's this analysis, but a lot of people and all of us got disappointed somehow with Russia from a military point of view. And when you look at the recent history, more or less is understandable. In the last, Putin took over in the early 2000s, right? After a complete disorganization of the state, a default
right.
of internal and external debt, a lot of corruption in the army. And the first 10 to 15 years was basically a reorganization period. And in the last 25 years, Russian GDP was more or less 80% of Brazilian GDP, which is impossible for Russia to have been investing in a military that would face US or even UK or France. From an economic point of view.
Yes.
But look, if Brazil, if we all decide there's a consensus of the society to invest in military with our size, we would be a regional power, and that's it.
Yeah.
What is the real power in Russia on the military? They need the troops from South Korea, drones from Iran.
Yeah.
What's going on there? So
it turns out that model, that highly centralized model, is really bad for war fighting. Right? As someone who was a young lieutenant, like 40 years ago, like our model, the Western military model, it'd be Brazil's military model too, is you really empower the young soldiers, the young NCOs. They had a very top-down model, and that infiltrated and corrupted their capacity to actually fight and win wars. And so you saw them fail in Ukraine dramatically. It's also the case that one should never, as anybody who's read any military history, you should never forget that it's always harder to fight an away game. Just like your football teams always like to play in their home stadium, the Ukrainians were playing in their home stadium and had something at stake. And the Russians were playing political, right? So it's just different. So the intensity of the mind is very focused when it's your family that's sitting right behind you, as opposed to you're going to go back and sit in the barracks and smoke a cigarette. And so don't underestimate that. The other thing that happens in these centralized models, and by the way, Xi Jinping is very worried about this too. His generals are lying to him as well. We should think about that. That military hasn't fought a war for a long time. Another reason he won't go after Taiwan is it might just not work. Because they may fail. Their ships may not sail. Their soldiers may not fight as hard, and their air force will break down pretty fast. But they didn't even have the industrial base to continue to build. You're right about drones, right? Iranian drones, Chinese money buying Iranian crude oil, then buying Russian oil. They didn't have an economy that was stacked, capable of actually doing this. And so I'll close with this thought. I always remember when I was the Secretary of State that my most important tool wasn't the U.S. military when I was negotiating. It mattered. You need to be able to show that you have power, military, hard power. But the most important tool was the American economy. Like, that's why everyone wanted to talk to me. Like, hey, Mike, we'd love to come trade with you. We'd love to come invest with you. We want our kids to go to school there. We want your companies to come train and educate our companies. Incredible power. And the Russians, just to your point about the size of their economy, there's no there. It's a resource country.
Yeah, absolutely. Mike, to conclude, last point, not necessarily the easiest. Let's talk a little bit about Middle East. Yeah.
Sure, I'll do the middle. I'll do 3,000 years of history in 30 seconds.
It's interesting talking about history. We had about 2 years ago this terrorist attack of Hamas to Israel, and triggered a whole series of crises that culminated with Israel, Iran, now Israel, U.S., Iran conflict. Even though that we are in a ceasefire, not clear the near future of this conflict. But going a little bit back, I think the Hamas attack to Israel was related to something positive. If you look at the region and what was happening in the last 5 years, and I think we talked about that before, there was a positive moment. First, a lot of new young rulers, quite sophisticated, globalized, understand the context of the world, tech-educated, huge investments in Saudi on these mega cities, more cranes than in China. Probably part of that will not work, but it's someone that is investing in tourism, is not focused on wars, right? First time 3 years ago, the U.S., the Israel and Egypt Marine doing exercise together. Saudi and Israel were weeks or a couple of months for an economic agreement. Saudi football team played in Tehran, and with immense acceptance of the society. Women driving cars, going to jobs in Saudi. The region at the end of the day was moving in a positive trend. And the loser of the positive trend is the radicalism. And the radicalism reacted. That was my reading of the Hamas reaction. And the question for you is, first, how we will develop this more acute moment of Israel-Iran situation. What is the target, the objectives? We don't believe in an exogenous change in regime. Needs to be an endogenous change of regime. In the long term, we can go back to the positive trend in the region.
Yes. Unlike the conflict in Europe, I actually see a very positive set of indicators that suggest we're going to get to a better place than we had before October 7th. You're right. That was a big break. What was the break? There were these Gulf Arab nations all moving towards modernity. That's what you're describing, right? Increasing opportunity for women, all the things where these leaders had moved away from extremism towards building something that was good. Not a democratic model, right? These are monarchies, but something that was moving towards a Western model of economy and a more Western model for how they treat their people. They're all to the good. And the Abraham Accords were a piece of that, right? These nations finally recognizing Israel's right to exist. And all the good things, all the economic growth and all the technology was happening either in Israel or in these Gulf Arab states, with the exception being Iran. Iran had adopted in 1979 a different model, which was this theocracy, and it had not moved towards modernity. It had continued to oppress its people in terrible ways. Its economy had elements that were good, but mostly no one was going from the world to say, I want to study in Tehran University, right? So they were moving backwards, or at least weren't advancing. And so they'd use these proxies through the region, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq, to keep some balance. And there had been kind of a deal that had been struck with the Israelis and Hamas, right? It was, you can come work here, people in Gaza can come work here. And then I think the Iranians saw that they were at risk of being so isolated and so backwards that internal pressure would be so great that the regime would be overthrown. And so they said, we're going to take our moment and see if we can't go scare the hell out of the Middle Easterners and convince them that we're still going to be around. And of course, it just didn't work. The Israelis said, no, they're not going to live with this. The Israeli leadership, and this isn't just Netanyahu, this is the entirety of Israeli leadership said, we're going to go take this risk down. They did. It's not gone. Hamas is still there. Hezbollah is still there, but they are greatly diminished. Syria fell, right? A big blow to the Russians and the Iranians who had supported Assad. So their power is diminished, and there is real hope that you can build out a model, and that one day, and we never know when this day will come, that the Iranian people will get their shot. Which is, just as we didn't know the day the Soviet Union would fall, we don't know the day that the people of Iran will rise as well. I pray that it's as soon as possible. They deserve it. They're an amazing people. To have them part of the global economy would be really great. By the way, they would then go compete with it'd just be glorious. And, if I think of being, a father in Iran, there's nothing more that you could do for your daughter or your granddaughter than try and figure out how to fundamentally alter the leadership there. She'll live a far better life if you're able to pull that off without getting killed, which is the challenge, which is that the regime still has the weapons, the guns, the capacity to terrorize. I mentioned to you, little reported, after the strike that the United States took on Fort Natanz and Esfahan, the Iranians went out and rounded up a couple thousand leaders inside of the country and threw them in prison. Anybody they thought might be associated with the attacks, that is, having cooperated with the U.S. or with Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, or even people they thought, we've been waiting for a chance to go get them. And I suspect that there will be several thousand more detentions in Iran in the coming weeks as they try to limit the risk to their regime. That's terrible news, but those moments also often are precipitative. Mm-hmm. There will be some leader of some unit in some state that says, I'm not going to shoot my own people. I'm not going to go arrest my neighbor, and it unravels. And I hope that moment comes quickly, because if it does, you can really rebalance that place. And deeply selfishly, as someone who served a president who puts America first, right, famously, there is nothing that would be better for the United States of America than to see that day come forward. It means a stable, more prosperous Middle East means that we won't have to go send our Marines there again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that'd be really good. I'm very hopeful that there's a model now that the groundwork has been laid for. I appreciate all the hard work the Israelis did to give us this opportunity. Not without excess in some places, but the effort was worthy, and I think changed the region all for the good.
Yeah. Well, Mike, we came to an end.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Minister Jumar.
Minister Jumar, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being with us here today.
Yeah. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Minister Jumar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very interesting.
Andre, I hope we accomplished the mission.
Yes.